It was my first year of college, and I was excited to move into the dorms and finally have my own space. My roommate, Emily, seemed nice at first. She was quiet and kept to herself, which was fine by me. We exchanged pleasantries when we first met and then settled into the rhythm of dorm life. At least that's how it started. The first couple of weeks were uneventful. We would pass each other in the hallway, talk about our classes, but for the most part, we kept to ourselves. Emily spent a lot of time studying in the library, while I went out with friends or stayed in my room to catch up on shows. It wasn't until I started hearing strange noises late at night that I began to feel uneasy. It was subtle at first, a faint scratching sound coming from the walls. I thought it was just the old building settling, but the sounds grew louder, more persistent. It would happen every night, around 2 a.m., like clockwork. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to ignore it when I heard something else. Footsteps, soft but distinct. I could tell they were coming from the direction of Emily's side of the room. I sat up, heart racing. Emily was supposed to be studying in the library. I hadn't seen her come back. I crept out of bed and glanced toward her side of the room. Her bed was made untouched. The desk was empty, but the sound of footsteps continued. It was as if someone was pacing back and forth on her side of the room. I hesitated, unsure whether I should wake her up or just call campus security. But before I could decide, the footsteps stopped. Everything went silent, except for the hum of the old air conditioner. The next morning, I asked Emily if she'd come back to the room late the night before. She looked at me, confused. "No," she said, her brow furrowed. "I was in the library all night. I didn't get back until after 3 a.m. That was the moment I realized something wasn't right. The noises continued for days, and every time I asked Emily about it, she had no explanation. She seemed unaware of anything unusual, acting completely normal, but I wasn't convinced. Then, one night, things escalated. I woke up to find the room colder than usual. The lights flickered and I could see my breath in the air. I turned to Emily's side of the room, and there, standing at the foot of her bed, was a figure, a tall, shadowy figure that seemed to hover just above the ground. It had no features, just a dark, shifting form. I gasped, but when I blinked, the figure was gone. I scrambled to turn on the light, but everything was normal again. Emily was sound asleep, oblivious to what had just happened. I couldn't take it anymore. I started sleeping with the lights on, and I would avoid the room as much as possible. Eventually, I found another place to stay, and the strange occurrences stopped. I never saw Emily again after that year, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that something in that dorm was watching me, something that wasn't quite human. I had just moved into an off-campus apartment with a girl named Sarah. We met through a mutual friend, and I thought she seemed normal enough. She was friendly but reserved, always on her phone or reading, and I was okay with that. We kept our interactions polite, but there was something about Sarah that made me uneasy from the start. She never seemed fully present, like her mind was always elsewhere. At first, the apartment was great, quiet, with large windows and a balcony that overlooked the city. I thought it would be the perfect place to focus on my studies and unwind after a long day. But after a few weeks, I began to notice strange things happening. It started with small things, lights being left on in the middle of the night, the TV turning on by itself, and doors that would be locked when I knew I had left them open. At first, I brushed it off as nothing more than forgetfulness, or maybe even a faulty electrical system. But then, it started getting worse. One night, I woke up to find Sarah standing in the middle of the living room, staring out the window. The apartment was pitch black, and the only light came from the dim glow of the street lamps below. Her face was expressionless, her eyes wide and unblinking. I called out her name several times, but she didn't respond. I walked up to her, tapping her on the shoulder. She didn't flinch. It was like she was in some kind of trance. "Sarah?" I asked again, my voice trembling. Finally, she turned around slowly, her eyes hollow. "What?" she whispered, as if she hadn't even heard me approach. She blinked, her expression shifting as if she had just snapped out of some kind of daze. "I was just looking at the city," she said, her voice quiet, almost robotic. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe she had just been lost in thought. But the unease lingered. Why had she been standing there for so long, so still in the dark? That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing odd noises, creaks in the floorboards, whispers coming from the walls. Every time I glanced at Sarah's room, I could see a faint light coming from beneath the door like she was awake. But when I checked, the light was off. I was starting to lose track of what was real and what wasn't. The next few days were a blur of weird occurrences. I would come home to find Sarah's room empty, but her phone and belongings were always in place. And every time I would sit in the living room, I would catch glimpses of her reflection in the corner of my eye, watching me from the shadows. Then, one evening, I came home to an unnerving scene. The front door was wide open, even though I was sure I had locked it before I left. As I stepped inside, the air felt heavy, and the temperature dropped. I called out for Sarah, but there was no response. I walked through the apartment, calling her name over and over, but it wasn't until I reached the balcony that I saw her. She was standing there again, in the same trance-like state, staring down at the street below. This time, however, there was something different about her posture. It was as if she was waiting for something. "Sarah!" I screamed, rushing to her side. She didn't react. She just stood there, her eyes fixed on something in the distance, her hands trembling slightly. I grabbed her arm, shaking her. "What's wrong with you?" Suddenly she snapped out of it, her body jerking as if she was waking up from a deep sleep. Her expression was blank, but she seemed aware of her surroundings again. "Sorry, I don't know. I didn't mean to worry you." That was the last straw. I couldn't live like this anymore. I called the landlord and moved out the very next day. As I packed up my things, I noticed that Sarah wasn't around. I asked the landlord about her, but he didn't have any information. She had simply vanished, leaving no trace behind. I don't know what happened to her, or if she was ever real at all. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I wonder if I ever really knew her, or if something dark had been controlling her all along. I moved into a new apartment my sophomore year, looking for a fresh start. The previous year had been rough, with my old roommate, Olivia, becoming increasingly erratic. She had started out as a sweet girl, but by the end of the semester I noticed her behavior was growing more disturbing, like someone was slowly taking over her mind. After a few strange incidents, I decided to get a new roommate for the coming year. That's when I met Rachel. She seemed normal at first, a little quiet but friendly enough. She had recently transferred to our school and was looking for a place to stay, so we decided to room together. The apartment was small but cozy, and I was hopeful that this year would be different. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. We'd hang out after class, watch movies, and even study together. She was a bit reserved, but that didn't bother me. However, things began to shift around the end of the second month. It started with subtle changes. Rachel became more withdrawn, and she started staying in her room for days at a time. At first, I thought she was just going through a rough patch, maybe dealing with the stress of school, but it was the way she would act when she did come out of her room that made me uneasy. Her eyes would be wide, almost too wide, and she'd speak in a soft, raspy voice as though she was in a dreamlike state. I would ask if she was okay, and she would always reply with a faint smile, "I'm fine, just tired." But she wasn't, just tired. There was something off about her, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then came the first night that I truly felt something was wrong. It was a Friday night, and I was heading to bed after a long week of classes. As I passed Rachel's room, I noticed the light was still on, even though it was nearly 2 a.m. I knocked gently on her door, just to check if she was all right. There was no response. I knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. Was starting to feel a sense of unease, but I opened the door anyway. Rachel was sitting on her bed, her back to the door. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from her desk lamp. Her head was tilted slightly to the side, and she was staring blankly at the wall in front of her. "Rachel," I called, stepping inside the room. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond at first. Then, very slowly, she turned her head to face me. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her lips curled into a slow, unnerving smile. "I'm fine," she whispered, the words coming out in a strained, almost robotic tone. "Everything is fine." But it wasn't fine. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something in her voice was wrong, hollow, and lifeless. I quickly told her to get some rest, hoping she'd go to sleep and the strange moment would pass. But as I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off. The next day, Rachel wasn't in her room. I thought maybe she was out for the day, but by the evening, I started to get worried. I knocked on her door several times, but there was no answer. The door was locked, which was unusual. Rachel had never locked her door before. I decided to call her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Something wasn't right. I felt a growing sense of dread, but it wasn't until late that night that I realized just how wrong things had become. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud thump coming from Rachel's room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I waited for a few seconds, straining to hear anything else. There was nothing. No movement, no sounds. Just an eerie silence. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and forced the door open with despair. What I saw when I stepped inside the room made my stomach churn. Rachel was standing in front of her window, her back to me. The room was dark except for the street light outside casting long shadows across the floor. But there was something unnatural about her stance. She wasn't just standing there, she was swaying back and forth slowly like a pendulum. "Rachel," I called, my voice trembling. She didn't move. I stepped closer, but just as I was about to reach out, she turned to face me. Her eyes were wide open, but she wasn't blinking. Her expression was vacant, as if she was staring straight through. "Me, I've been waiting," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Waiting for what?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "Waiting for it to come back," she replied, her lips curling into that same eerie smile. "It's coming for me, and I can't leave." Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me, as if the air itself had turned thick and suffocating. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, as though they were moving on their own. I grabbed Rachel's arm, pulling her toward the door, but she resisted. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't leave. Not yet." Before I could react, the lights flickered, and I heard the sound of someone, or something, breathing heavily behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there, no one else in the room. Just me and Rachel standing there in the dark. I didn't stay another minute. I pulled her out of the room and dragged her to the living room, where we stayed the rest of the night. When morning came, I called campus security and told them everything. They took Rachel away, and she was placed in the psychiatric unit for evaluation. I later learned that Rachel had a history of mental health issues, but what terrified me most was what the doctors told me. They said she had been waiting for something, a figure from her past that she believed was coming back to claim her. I don't know if they ever figured out exactly what was going on with her, but I do know one thing for sure. I never saw her again. And every now and then, when I'm alone in my apartment, I swear I can hear someone breathing behind me. The air feels colder, and I wonder